Hello, everybody. I'm Ames Morrison. I'm the co-founder and winemaker for Medlock Ames. And I'm really happy to welcome you all and to our Father's Day pregame. And we really appreciate you sitting down with us and hearing about some of the wines we've chosen to pour today, and talk a little bit about our fathers and what this day means to us. So the first wine that I wanted, so I think we're going to keep you guys all in mute. And if you have any questions, you can type them into the group chat. And at the very end, we'll unmute everybody, I think, so that if you have any other questions, and then we'll try to answer them in real time or save them to the end. Just depends on how it goes. And the first wine that we are going to pour for you guys is our. Also, the wines we're pouring are some wines from our library, and then we've got a large format, so those are kind of fun to share. So the first wine is our 2017 Lower Slope Chardonnay. We have about 5 acres planted to Chardonnay. Most of our vineyard is Cab, but we have one part of our vineyard that's in the Russian River Valley, and we grow Chardonnay there. And when we first found that parcel of land, it had just been planted, and we didn't really think of ourselves as Chardonnay people, but we wanted to honor the commitment that the previous owner had. They'd done a lot of research to figure out what the best variety would be to grow in that little part of the vineyard. And so they chose a specific clone of Chardonnay called the Seas clone. And most people in the West Coast, or most people in California, are familiar with Seas candy. Or if you've ever been to the San Francisco airport, you can buy it in the kiosks there. It's a great travel gift. But there are these really fancy chocolates that are really delicious. And the family that owned the Seas family owned a ranch in Napa Valley where they were growing Chardonnay. And it's sort of that the Chardonnay that comes from that vineyard is known for its sort of a lemony character of their Chard. And so we took cuttings from that vineyard, or the previous owner before us took cuttings from the Seas vineyard and planted them at Bell Mountain Ranch. And there are kind of 2 ways you can propagate vines. You can take one cutting from a vine and then grow a vine from that, and then take cuttings from those vines. And those are called clones, and everyone's going to be identical. They're clones. But then there's another thing called a selección massal, or field selection, which is what this clone is. So someone went through and took a bunch of cuttings from that vineyard and planted them into vines. And when you do a field selection, you get a lot more diversity. So it kind of creates a little bit more complexity in the wine. It makes it a little bit more interesting. And we also, in this blend, we've also got a little bit of Old Wente clone. The Old Wente clone is kind of famous for its hens and chicks. It's got both really big grapes and really small grapes on the same cluster. And those, the wine that is made from the Old Wente clone has more of what we call pomme fruit. So it's got pear aromas and sort of apple aromas. And so the blend of the Old Wente and the Seas clone creates this really nice harmonious balance between pear and lemon that's really delicious. We also do a lot of lees stirring on this wine. So we mix the tank or the barrel, and that suspends the yeast cells that have finished their job and kind of settle at the bottom of the barrel. We stir the barrel, and all those yeast cells get resuspended. And every time we do that, we kind of break down the cell wall a little bit, and there are amino acids inside those finished yeast cells. And when they're released into the wine, it gives it this really rich character. So even though this Chardonnay has a lot of crispness and acidity that's really fresh and lively, it also has this creamy richness to it. So I really love those two, the interplay between the crispness and the creaminess. And so because it's Father's Day, I wanted to talk about a few fathers that are really important to us. So one is, so Chris James, he's the Medlock half of Medlock Ames. And his father, who passed away about 5 years ago, his name was Greg, and we always called him GJ or Greg. And the very first year we found the vineyard in 1997, it was before an El Nino season, which is, anyone on the West Coast knows, it's super high rainfall. And I think typically we get maybe an average of about 20 inches of rain a year in California. And during an El Nino year, we can get twice that. And it all comes in a very compact period. So there's lots of flooding, and there's a risk of erosion and landslide. So it's something that we have to be careful about when we get those weather patterns. And so the very first year we found the vineyard, there were a lot of old terraces on the vineyard that were really steep, and they were in danger of collapsing. And so we were really worried about all this rainfall kind of washing out a big portion of the vineyard. So Chris's dad and I and Chris moved 50 tons of rock and hand built all these walls that were retaining walls for the terrace. And when we were doing it, Chris and I were kind of goofing around a little bit and taking our time. And Chris's dad was like kind of no nonsense, and he said, "Okay, come on, boys, we're burning daylight." And so that's always been sort of Chris's and my motto or slogan whenever there's a lot of work to be done and we need to stop goofing around and get to work. We always say, "Stop burning daylight." So the next, and then also we have another. The year that Chris's father passed away, we decided to make a special wine to honor him, sort of a tribute to him. And this was this was a blend of some of our best Cabernet blocks. They're really big and bold Cabernets, so it's more of a masculine style. And to kind of honor that very first year when we were working, we decided to call that wine 50 tons because it represents the 50 tons of rock that we moved by hand. And it was just also a way for us to kind of pay homage to Greg James. The next one I'm going to pour is our 2008 Cates and Bees Cabernet. And (2008), so almost all the wines we're pouring are kind of years of extreme. So the 2017 Chardonnay we just poured, that was one of the hottest, or not necessarily the hottest, but we had the most hot days on record. We had over 10 days that were greater than 100 degrees, and that's really really rare. Usually we get 1 or 2 days like that. In 2017 we had a lot. It was a really hot year. And 2008, which is the next wine I'm going to pour, our 2008 Cates and Bees. That year was really, in the beginning, the early part of the season, it was really cold. So we usually have 2 or 3 nights where frost is a risk. And the time when frost is something we have to worry about is between bud break, which is usually the end of March, until right around Mother's Day. So that the early May. At that point, the vines are growing. There's green growth, and if we get a cold night, it can freeze the clusters, and we lose the crop for that year. And so, in order to protect against that, we turn on our overhead sprinklers in the vineyard, and even if it's below freezing, as long as there's fresh water being laid out on the vines very frequently, just as long as it takes the butterfly sprinkler to do a full revolution, which is maybe 30 seconds or so, then as long as there's fresh water, it will freeze, but it keeps the vine exactly at freezing, and it never gets below freezing. And so usually we have to do that maybe 2 or 3 nights a year. And in 2008, we had to do it, I think 20 nights. And so we have to do it in the middle of the night. It's hard work. And so then we also had really high rainfall that year in the early part of the season. And then we had a lot of fires that weren't close to us, but they were pretty frightening. So it was just, and really windy. So it was like, made the fire a big scare. And, but despite that, it turned out to be an excellent vintage. And so that the wine we're tasting right now is our Kates and Bees, which comes from two blocks that are next to each other. They're the best, the two best blocks of Cabernet we have in the ranch. One's called Kate's Block, named after my wife Kate, and Bee's Block is named after Chris's wife Bee. And when we first were making the names for all the blocks of grapes, my kind of more scientific inclination was to just call them all I just called them, CS1 for the first block of Cabernet, CS2, CS3. And I was explaining that to Chris, and he said, that is so boring. And we're in the wine business because it's beautiful and it's fun. So we have to have more romantic names. So why don't we name two of the blocks after our wives? And at the time, it just seemed like a kind, friendly thing to do for our wives, good for marital politics. But then it just, as luck would have it, a few years later, when we harvested the first grapes, the first crop from those vines, they turned out to be the best cabs we made. We have about 30 different blocks of Cabernet planted, and those two stood out head and shoulders above the rest. We didn't have very much, so we blended it together, and we thought we might, blend it into our regular cab, but it seemed too good, and we just loved the story of that, the romantic nature of those vines, and then also the wine that we get from those blocks tends to have a really, it's a really, it's kind of, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit, but it has a feminine character to it. They're more velvety and graceful wines than our other cabs. And so we thought it's a perfect wine to name after our wives. And so 2008, now these wines are getting a little bit on in years. But with time, you can get these really interesting aromas that develop in wine. We say that there are primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas that you can find in wine. The primary flavors or aromas come from the fruit itself. So when you smell fruit or flowers in wine, that comes from the fruit itself. And then you get, and so we call those the primary aromas. Then you also get flavors that come from the fermentation process or the aging process. So you can get, like in the case of Chardonnay, you can get sort of a toasty, almost a baked good, like bread kind of aromas. You can get, for Cabernet, you can definitely get oak aromas that come from the oak aging. And those are all and you can get sort of coffee aromas also from the barrel, or toastiness. And those are all the secondary aromas. And then with time in the bottle, 10 years or so, sometimes not quite that long, you can get what we call tertiary aromas. And these are when some of the individual aroma compounds in the wine start to slightly oxidize. And so you can get these really interesting aromas like soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce that add more complexity to the wine. Over time, eventually, those will push the wine too far into that oxidized state, and you can get what we call acetaldehyde, which is sort of like the sherry aroma. And so small amounts just make the wine more complex, more interesting, but eventually it can be too much. So at a certain point, all wines will sort of pass their best by date. But the 08 Kates and Bees is really starting to pick up some of those tertiary aromas that make it really complex and interesting. And it's still retaining a lot of its the red, like the red fruit that it had from that vintage. So it has sort of like a cherry liqueur and almost some cranberry aromas along with violets. So it's and then when you add in a little bit of that soy character, it just makes it really interesting. So someone was just asking how the Kates and Bees has evolved over time. So that's a great question. So when we first determined that this was we just kind of made this our best wine. It's the most expensive wine we make, and it's sort of we always want to put our best foot forward. And so originally it was just a blend of the Kate's block and the Bees block, but because we always wanted it to be the best, we sometimes do a little bit of tweaking to this wine. So we'll blend in a little bit of Malbec and Merlot, and I would say that Malbec is our secret ingredient. It just kind of gives everything this little extraness to it. It provides a lot of fruit, this inky, like purple hue to it, and then the Merlot also tends to soften and round out some of the edges. So it kind of creates a more harmonious blend to put what we usually do is the cab, which is the base of it. That's usually 75 to 90%, and then a little bit of Malbec and Merlot. We've also sort of experimented with this wine and all of our red wines, really about how long we do how long we age in the cellar, and we've sort of longer aging allows more time for the tannins to soften. The oxygen in the that kind of migrates into the wine through the pores in the wood. They create this. They allow the wine to soften a little bit. But if you age the wine too long, it starts to get a dried out character. So we've sort of honed in on somewhere in the 18-month range. It's just sort of the sweet spot for aging. And then we've also played around with how we ferment the wine, like how hot we ferment it, how long the skins stay in contact with the wine before we drain and press, which barrels we use. So we're constantly reevaluating and sometimes we feel like we've hit on the perfect formula, but we don't ever want to rest on our laurels. So we like to always keep one hand in the experimentation part of it, just to try to figure out exactly how we can improve the wine always. And so I also just, another father that's important to me is my own father. My father passed away last fall, and he lived to a ripe old age. And I always say he's the most successful person I've ever met, because not in material wealth, but he always lived his life exactly on his own terms. And so I feel like he got more out of life than most people do. And I really admire him a lot. And he also really inspired me in my farming. My father was a farmer his whole life. And he really taught me the value of hard work and love of the land. And I think indirectly, he also inspired me to become an organic farmer. I always like to tell this story that when I was a kid, my father rented out part of our farm to another farmer, and that farmer was supposed to grow corn on it, I think, but he put it in this government set-aside program and didn't do anything to the land. And over several years, the fields just became infested with thistles. And when the lease expired and my father took the farm back, he just had this hundreds of acres of thistles to deal with. And he researched like what the best way to get rid of them was. And the sort of two recommendations were you could spray them with I can't remember what it was, but it was a synthetic pesticide, herbicide, or you could dig them all up. And my father, I think it was partly stinginess on his part and not being afraid to put in the sweat, but he decided he would dig up hundreds of acres of thistles by hand, by himself. And every time I was home, I was, during the summer, I had a shovel in my hand and I was digging up thistles, and it took 10 years. And now it's hard to find a thistle on that land. And it just really inspired me and sort of taught me the value of that, of how to affect change slowly over time. But it's possible, and it's important to do things the right way, even though it's not always the easy way. And so a few years ago, we made a late harvest Sauvignon Blanc, and we named it Thistle, sort of in honor in honor of him. My father wouldn't drink it. He was definitely a bourbon man and was never really into wine, but he appreciated what I was doing, and so that always meant a lot to me. Okay, so the next wine we're going to pour is our 2014 Cabernet Sauvignon, and this is a wine that this is in Magnum, and so I'm not going to open the big one because I'm just by myself, and I'm not going to be able to finish this much wine. Okay. Oh, just a quick diversion here. Somebody asked on Facebook, do we still have Royal? So no, I had a dog, an Irish Terrier named Royal, and she was sort of the winery mascot for years and years. And she died about 4 years ago. And but I always used to say she was our greatest salesperson, because she would, whenever we had a tour of the vineyard, she'd greet people, and whenever we'd walk them through the vineyard, she'd tag along and just made friends with all of our visitors. And I have an 11-year-old son, and he is dying for me to get another dog. So that's definitely on my to-do list. And then another question we had is, what makes the buttery taste in Chardonnay? And the buttery taste in Chardonnay comes from this this process called the malolactic fermentation. So when we're making wine, we're turning sugar or juice, the sugar and juice into alcohol. That's the fermentation process. It's performed by yeast. And then there's a secondary fermentation that is another microbiological process where we turn malic acid, which is the predominant acid, or one of the predominant acids in grapes, and that's what gives grapes their and malic acid is the acid found in apples, and it kind of gives the apples that tart character. And there is a bacteria called Enococcus enyi, and it eats it converts the malic acid into lactic acid, and lactic acid is the acid found in dairy products, and it's less acidic. It's a softer acid, and so it's a process that might happen anyway. So we want to control that process. So we always make sure it happens in the winery before we bottle the wine, because if it happens after we bottle the wine, it can make the wine taste fizzy and kind of gives the wine this haziness that we wouldn't want. There's a type of wine where that actually is done on purpose. There's a Portuguese wine called Vinho Verde where they have that process happen in the bottle, and it gives the wine like a really light spritz. But typically you don't want it to happen in the bottle. So you either force it to happen in the cellar, or you sterile filter the wine so that it can't happen in the bottle. Almost all reds go through that process, and with some white. So typically Sauvignon Blanc does not go through the process, but Chardonnay does. And you can so it definitely goes through that process, but depending on the fermentation temperature, you can affect the outcome of how buttery that aroma is. And there's this compound called diacetyl, and if the wine's fermented at a colder temperature, you can get a little bit more of it. And if you go too extreme, it can almost give the wine like a fake fake butter you get from popcorn. So that's definitely too extreme for my taste. But it's a style that some producers like to make their Chardonnay that way, and some consumers really like it. But I like just like a little hint of butter in my Chardonnay. So the next one we're pouring is our 14 Cab, and that is in Magnum. And Magnums are I think they're really fun to drink, and they're just really festive. They're 1.5 liters. It's two bottles of wine in one, and the geometry of this bottle impacts the aging characteristics of it. So we use the same size cork for this bottle as we do for this bottle, and but there's twice as much volume in the big bottle. And when we're bottling the wine, we we always turn it upside down and sparge it with nitrogen gas. So we have this pressurized nitrogen that we inject, just blow into the bottle, and it doesn't interact with anything. It's inert. But what it does is it's lighter than air. So it floats to the top, and its weight forces out all the air, which has oxygen in it. Then we fill it with wine immediately and put the cork in. And so it shouldn't have any oxygen in it at that point. But when we insert the cork, the nature of the cork is that it's kind of when you squeeze it and let go, it kind of returns to its normal shape. Because that's just based on the cellular structure of this comes from the bark of the cork oak tree. And when you push it into the bottle and squeeze it, it squeezes out all the air that's in these pores, and that eventually will go into the wine. And we know that we've calibrated or accounting for that. So so you're putting a small amount of oxygen into the wine, and over time that oxygen will interact with the wine and kind of start to affect its aging. The wine has our reds, or cabs especially, have a fair amount of tannin. Tannin is an antioxidant, so a lot of that oxygen is going to be tied up it's just going to be bound to the tannin in the wine, so it won't ever interact with the wine. But eventually that oxygen will, that oxygen that's inserted in the bottle will give the wine more aged character, and eventually, age it out of drinkability. But because we're injecting the same amount of oxygen but in twice as much wine with a Magnum, it takes longer to age. So wines will last longer, I guess, is the short way of saying what I've said in the long way. So the wines will last longer the bigger the bottle is. 2014 was, I call it a magical vintage. It was the year when you couldn't do anything wrong. Both 2013 and 2014 were just delights to work with, both in the vineyard and the winery. We don't get many years like that. 2010 and 2011 were the coldest years on vintage. It was impossible to get things right. So when 13 and 14 came around, I felt like we were due. It was sort of karma that we needed to get some really easy vintages. The 13 and 14 were both really different from each other, but one thing they had in common is they're really warm. And I find that warmer years, even hot years, tend to be best for Medlock Ames. Our growing region is in the Alexander Valley, which is, as California goes, or as the coastal valleys of California go, it's a little bit on the warm side, but we're in the coldest part of it. And we're probably at the kind of the extreme end of ripenability of Cab, where our vineyard is situated. It's the southernmost point of the Alexander Valley. And it probably has more in common with the Russian River Valley climatic conditions. And so it's hard to ripen Cabernet. And we usually finish our harvest in, well into November. And, but 2014, we finished harvesting on October 16th, which is probably the earliest we've ever finished. And just the wines are so good. They're just, it's got lots of blueberry, blackberry, and raspberry aromas. And just the three of those together are just a beautiful combination. And usually when wine's fermenting in the tank, or as soon as it's finished fermenting and macerating, it's at least drinkable state. It's got lots of tannin in it, and it's sort of unresolved tannin. And I'm used to drinking wines like that because I'm evaluating wines as they're, trying to figure out when it's the ideal time to drain and press them. So my palate can handle those high tannin periods of wine, and then over the next 18 months it softens and becomes prettier and more drinkable. But the 14s at that stage were almost ready to consume it. They were just really soft and beautiful, and over the past several years since then, they've just aged and developed even better. So I'm really excited about this wine, and I'm really glad for you guys to try it. And it's really fun to do it in these big formats. We also we make some 3-liter bottles, which are called Imperials, and then we make some 6-liter bottles, which are Jeroboams. And that I just like saying all the names of those large formats. and they're just fun for parties and festive occasions. And then I wanted to just like the other father I wanted to mention is, I guess this is kind of sounds egotistical. It's not really about me. It's just more about my son, who made me a father, and so I'm really grateful to him. I mentioned he's 11. He's been stuck home for the past few months, like most of the world. And every year we have a big wine dinner in June. We weren't able to do it this year because of COVID, but we have about 80 or 90 people. We have this big event we call Dinner in the Vineyard, where we invite our club to come and break bread with us, and usually have music. And it's this beautiful spot right where it's in Bees Block, where the Kates and Bees comes from. And it's this beautiful interface between the forest and the vineyard. And it's and sort of watching the sun go down and then the lights come on. It's just really beautiful. And I always get up and give a toast and a little speech before the assembled crowd. And I've done it enough times now that I feel it's it doesn't bother me. But the first the earlier years, I was pretty nervous to get up and talk in front of 80 people. And so my son, even at I think 3 or 4, he could somehow sense that I was a little bit apprehensive or nervous. And so as I was starting to give my speech, he ran up and just stood next to me and just held my hand while I was talking. And it's just, and even to this, years later, he still does it. I'm always curious when he's gonna outgrow it, but it's something that is really touching to me. And I feel so honored to be a father, and so I'm really grateful to him. Someone asks, will a Magnum age twice as long as a 750? I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. I would say no, because I would say no. I mean, I think our cabs can age 15 to 20 years, and I don't think the Magnum's can age 40 years, but I don't know. We haven't had wine in Magnum that long yet. I think the very oldest ones we have are from 2002, but they're still tasting great. I am just grateful to you all for joining us for this discussion and giving me a chance to rant and share my stories and my love of these three wines. And I hope that you all have a wonderful Father's Day. If anyone has any questions, you can shout them out or message me. But if not, I hope you'll have a wonderful day. And we've opened up our tasting room it's by appointment right now, and we're spacing everybody out, and we're really glad to be able to see our customers again. And if you all have a chance to visit, we would love to see you. We're doing it in a very safe way, but it means a lot to us to be able to see our customers again. It's kind of very normalizing. But anyway, just wanted to say thanks to you, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.